Where the Dogs Bark with Their Tails is the story of a family as told by 4 members, but mostly 3. So we have Antoine, Lucinda, and Petit Frère, and they tell the story to the niece, whose name we don't learn. And the story kind of begins as the niece decides to look over her notes in an effort to kind of collect the notes, compile the notes, and create a kind of narrative. And to get started, I wanted to read 3 of Julia's beautiful phrases that kind of capture the spirit of this kind of collation. So she says early on, I hope to understand by looking backward the contours of my own existence. Towards the end, she says, I had drunk up their stories and their silences eagerly, as though something important was about to be lost, a mythical time from before I was born. And yet she also says, and we talked about this before, from the start, our family's roots were nestled deep where chimeras live. Our legends and histories are unknowable, amalgam of fiction and half-told stories. My first question to you, Estelle-Sarah, is why tell this story in this way, which is to say, with 4 voices, or rather 3 voices, recounting their understanding of their family history as refracted through the niece over this generation?
I wanted to tell the story of the French Caribbean islands in the 20th century. And like all the stories, this is a complex story. And I thought that the easiest way to show the reader that this is complex is to have 4 people telling it, so they can tell it from their own perspective and show that when you live something, some events, even historical events, you have your own perception of this event, which is not necessarily the same perception for another person. First, if you are a woman, you probably will not have exactly the same perception as a man of the same event. When you are the youngest in a family, you will not have the same perception as the eldest, etc., etc. So it was interesting for me to have just like a conversation with the reader. Everyone is around the table and everyone speaks chacun son tour. And so everyone can tell his own story and how it affected him or her.
Right, and not only do we get each individual story, but we even get, and this was some of my favorite moments, each character saying, no, 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 don't listen to Petit Frère. He's obviously exaggerating. Listen to my version of the story.
Yeah, exactly like a family conversation where you have the brother who will say something and the sister will say, no, it's not like that. And yeah.
So Julia, let's go to you. Estelle-Sarah describes the story as complex, and we would have to, I don't know who's read it here, but it's complex in its intellectual and formal approach here. So not only does it move between 4 characters, but it sweeps, as Estelle-Sarah says, over the course of the 20th century, right? So we start in 47, move to 48, go from 48 to 60, 1960, and then 1960, 2006. It moves between Guadeloupe and Creole to France and in French. How did you, as the translator, not only negotiate these 4 different voices, but how did you negotiate them as they moved through time and through space?
Yeah, thanks. I think I had a lot of help from Estelle-Sarah. As I mentioned earlier, we were set to meet during the pandemic in France to talk in person about all of this. And when that got canceled, it involved me doing a lot of emails to you and asking. And so I think, I have Google Docs and spreadsheets of all of your answers that explain each of these characters. And Antoine, I got to know her very well, and she reminds me very much, I told you, of a great aunt I have, very similar characteristics, very headstrong women with a lot of daring choices that were probably like looked upon as strange over time. So I drew inspiration from her, who was of that generation, I guess, when I was thinking about the English. But a lot of that I relied on Estelle-Sarah to open these characters to me. And can I jump back to your idea about the chimera? because I wanted to build off of what you said about the chimera. When I was thinking about this word for at least American readers, for Strauss and Drew being American, I was thinking about what the average American might know about the chimera. And some may not know it at all, but if you do, you might know the chimera as, you know, a monster, a mythological figure of many parts. And Estelle-Sarah, you and I talked about this, and I was so glad I had a hunch to ask her, because she said, yeah, in French, it means a lot more. All stories are mixed up in Guadeloupe, you told me. It's hard to tell a story precisely and accurately and get the right version. But I guess also in French, the chimera, the idea is also about the partially told story, about something. Correct me, what what more is there to say about that?
About the chimera, yeah, it refers to the specific history of Guadeloupe and the French islands, where we have a mixed society from the beginning, because people in Guadeloupe come from everywhere except from Guadeloupe in itself, because the Black people were brought as slaves from Africa. French white people were coming from France or from England. Indians came after Hindus, Indians from India, came after slavery to work. And we have also people coming from Syria, from Lebanon. Mm-hmm. So it's very mixed. And in fact, the people, the real Guadeloupeans, in fact, would be the Indians from Amerindians, you say that? Amerindian?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The indigenous people.
Indigenous people, but they disappeared a long time ago because of the colonization. They were all killed. So we are a mixed society coming from a lot of different parts of the world, which could be a chimera in itself.
And I didn't want to stop just at chimera. I think had I stopped with just the way the French was, it would have landed like this. All of our history took root in the land of chimeras. Mm-hmm. And it would have stopped there. And I expanded on it. You'll notice I wrote, our family's roots were nestled deep where chimeras live. Our legend and history is an unknowable amalgam of fiction and half-told stories. Mm-hmm. So that I added with the permission of Estelle-Sarah, because I think to land just on this idea of a mythological monster is not sufficient, mm-hmm. especially when we're talking about race and colonial stories. Yeah. It did not sit well. And so I wanted to expand it in that way.
And how fantastic that you're here to tell us this. And actually, in this, I'm so glad you brought this up, because we started by saying, you know, I wanted to tell the history of the French islands, mm-hmm. right? And so when we think about history, and certainly the way that history is taught and received, and you're a teacher, so you would be very sensitive to this, history is often taught in this kind of hegemonic, one-eyed, one point of view. Mm-hmm. And so to have the history, you know, maybe capital H, taught in textbooks and in schools, mm-hmm. refracted through a family history already breaks this apart. Mm-hmm. And then to have chimera on top of that, mm-hmm. destabilizes this sense of one narrative even more. I imagine you were thinking about this.
Yeah, of course, exactly. And it's also a psychological process. Excuse me, because in French islands, the history is here. It's a violent history. It's also finally a recent history compared to France. And every part of every community built its own myth and its own mythology. Former slaves had to build their own story because their former story was totally erased. So it was a new story to build in the island. Indians coming from India had to rebuild their own story too. French people had to build, white French people had to build their own story to justify their possessions and the fact that they own all the island. So this situation, social situation, has effects in private lives, and this kind of myth and building its one's own story is also the way in the families people are acting and telling how they live their lives.
There's a lovely passage. Are you interested in a passage that relates directly to it? This is the passage, Estelle-Sarah, that I signaled to you earlier today. My fiance became, and so this is the voice of the niece speaking. My fiance became interested in genealogy. He knew his own family's history in great detail. He had deeds, photographs, old jewelry, sheet music composed by a grandfather at the beginning of the century, bound journals from his great-grandfather. His parents had brought the first video cameras available to the public. On and on about the VHS tapes. To conserve is an instinct of the well-born, she writes, those who are careful to transmit the radiant trail of their family's line from generation to generation. I didn't possess that instinct. No document sat sheltered within the thick stone walls of my family home, no record of ancestors. We were too busy surviving, but I had a ledger of experiences, gestures, words that nourished me in subtle ways from beneath the soil. And you bring it back to the soil, which is of course, leading to the natural beauty of what we were speaking about earlier.
That's lovely, because it also reminds us that history is as philosophical as it is material, right? That if history, and that's how we start the book, right? She's saying, I have all of these conversations, I have all of these fragments, and now it's time to compile them and put them together.
Exactly. That's what the people in the French islands do every day. Yeah.
I want to ask about your personal history, because your family is originally from Guadeloupe, and much like the unnamed niece, you were born in Créteil, which is the suburb which you describe as a poor, drab suburb with no history, no rituals, and no tradition. It's a damning description. And of course, the unnamed niece doesn't identify totally with this drab suburb, although she does identify with being French, and increasingly over the course of her life feels more French. But when she travels to Guadeloupe, and this is the case of so many people who are born in one place and go back to the other, and kind of bridging, two seas or three seas, the locals tell her that she's not a real Guadeloupean. And yet she feels this identity, I'm quoting you here, in her body, in her words, in her way of understanding the diversity of the world. I imagine you've been asked this question a lot over the course of your press, but how much of the experience of the niece is your experience?
A lot of experience, yes, but it's not really me. It's really a character in the book. For example, I didn't have to faire une enquête to ask my aunt or my dad, because in my family we talk a lot. So I had all these memories and all these Guadeloupean experience told since I was a little girl. But I chose to have this niece wanting to know and not knowing things, because it allowed me to explain to the reader what was happening. And but it's true that her own experience is like mine, in the sense that I was born in the suburb of Paris, in Créteil. We had a conversation with Julia about what is a suburb in France, because it's not really like a suburb in the US. In France, we like to say that we are born in a city, in the center of a city, be it Paris or Lyon or Bordeaux, I don't know. Whereas the suburb is not a very attractive place in our minds in France. It's not the same, I know, in the US. And being born in that suburb, which has no specific qualities, no particularities, is less attractive for me when I was a young girl, as being born in Guadeloupe like my father, or even being born in northern France like my mother, because those are places much more characterized in the French mind as the suburb. Suburb is really the place of nowhere in France.
You mentioned, you mentioned Estelle-Sarah, in your description of the banlieue in Créteil, like the concrete and the walls and the windows that look the same with not a lot of like natural plant life. And I think that's interesting because the concrete arriving in Guadeloupe was a big part of the story that changed the landscape of Guadeloupe and changed the industrialization, et cetera. So the theme is kind of there. It has crossed. Yeah.
Well, I suppose even if we say we can put aside that, you know, you are not Venice, but how did you feel when you went to Guadeloupe? Did you feel Guadeloupean? And then the other question, I guess, relatedly, of course, is did you feel that kind of your research around this book and your writing of this book was a kind of immersion into your family's history and past?
I didn't have to do a lot of researches because, as I said, I knew well this story. It was more, this book was more like a love letter to Guadeloupe, and maybe an attempt to be accepted as a Guadeloupean, because like Denise, when I used to go there for holidays, people there was telling me that I am not really a Guadeloupean. And it's true in some way, because my mother is from northern France, nothing to do with Guadeloupe. I was born in the suburbs. I don't speak Creole. And finally, when I was there, I was just like an average French vacancier. Yeah, a visitor. Yeah. Except that my grandfather was still living there, and my father could tell me what was Guadeloupe when he was young. So I had some roots, but it was difficult, and I was really divided, partagé, between my love for this island and the fact that I had to say that I hadn't really experienced what was it to live on a daily basis in Guadeloupe.
You mentioned you don't speak Creole, but I heard in an interview that you gave today, I mean, you didn't give it today, I listened to it today, and you made the excellent point that actually by not speaking Creole, perhaps that gave you a kind of a different gaze on the society, right? Because if you were totally immersed in society, you didn't have that kind of outsider third perspective. Can you talk about how actually not being entirely from Guadeloupe actually paradoxically helped you understand the society better?
Yeah, because when you can faire un pas de côté, when you can
take a step to the side,
exactly, you see things better. As when you are totally immersed in a society. So it was probably easier for me to talk about this being living 7,000 kilomètres.
7,000 kilometers. It's not that big, the world.
From Guadeloupe, I was probably more free to tell some things than if I was living there. My brother lives there, and it's probably less easier for him to talk that freely about the Guadeloupean society. It would be the same if I had to talk about my northern family, probably that I have a perspective on it, which is absolutely not their perspective. And when you have to tell a story, it's easier to have that ce recul.
So Julia, let's go to you, which is to say that we've been talking about how Estelle-Sarah in some ways, certainly through your use of footnotes, is translating and sharing a Guadeloupean social history, political history with the French public. And you are doing the same thing by translating that French text into English, which is to say, you're translating in some ways the translation that's already happening. Did you feel this sense of meta translation, that you're translating two cultures? You know, by the time it arrives in English, in American and English bookshops, we're two steps away from the original place.
Yeah, indeed. I felt a lot of humility around this idea of, first, I bring humility to French anyway. It's not my native language. And so wanting to be sure that I have things right and talking to French speakers in my life about, did I get this joke? What is there a cultural nuance I don't understand? But to add the extra layer of Creole, I think you remember, I was like, wait, we need to be absolutely sure that I'm doing this properly. Yeah, and for example, in the book there's, and this is not maybe Creole, but le chip. Do you remember our talks about le chip? And so there's a professor at the Ohio State, or I met him through the Ohio State University, Eric Simi. He's Cameroonian, and I had met him, and I said, oh, he can tell me about le chip, because le chip is a prolonged sucking of the teeth that is like a sign of disdain. Okay, maybe you know. But so for the American reader, I couldn't just write cheap. I decided to write cheap and then do what's called a stealth gloss, which is where you embed into the sentence like some context for them to understand. And so I talked with some people, you know, in my African American communities, and I said, is there something that we could use? And, you know, they suggested the sucking of teeth like this, or even a neck roll, common in African American communities, but that is not the same. The cheap is very, can you do it, Estelle? Sarah?
No, it's like Creole. I don't know. I'm sure some people here, you can do it. Yeah, it's like that.
It's
maybe
the sound.
You can do it. Yeah. My daughter knows, but do you know that now the chip is forbidden in high school in France because all the young people do it. It has become a way of defying, défier your teacher, so it's forbidden.
Showing disrespect, and it's almost a political decision at this point for schools to do that. Yeah. So the cheap, I spent a lot of time. I tried to bring a lot of humility to that, and ask and get curious, and not assume like, oh, well, it must just be what Black people do in my country. No.
I can give the English perspective, which in England it's kiss my teeth, so it's often abbreviated to KMT. Yeah.
So you do it.
I don't do it. I mean, I don't do it, but I mean, in in these, yeah.
Maybe because of the islands too.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Maybe because of the islands too. No, it came from the English islands.
Absolutely.
And what Eric Chimi told me, it's definitely, you know, it's a product of the African diaspora, and so you'll see it many places. That's why he was able to inform. And yeah.
Do you have another? It's such a beautiful thing, because what this reminds us, of course, is that translation is so much more important. I mean, so much more kind of nuanced than just simply translating words, right? Because you're translating attitudes, ways of being in the world, ways of looking at the world. Can you give us maybe some other kind of rich conversations that you had about words and how to translate them and what they mean beyond just the words and the letters?
Yeah. Let's see. I mean, there were so many things we spoke about, and so many new things that I learned about France and the colonial experience. I think the biggest one for me was thinking about l'universalisme. We had a long conversation about that, and I really tried to insist on a longer footnote to kind of contextualize for Americans what that is. The American reader won't necessarily know that this is a very important part of the French Constitution, stating that all people are equal. But Estelle-Sarah, we talked long about that. That was one of the things. Yeah.
It's great that you bring up universalism. I guess it's also like like secularism, republicanism. I mean, there are all these kind of words, and they're often capitalized, that get transmitted across the Atlantic Ocean. Of course, America's now, or how that looks from the French perspective is kind of woke culture threatening this idea of universalism. This does actually get to a question that I had for you. And we'll talk about also a more kind of political question about you as translator when this is not your culture, which, you know, it's just a kind of hot topic. But thinking politically here, Estelle-Sarah, your descriptions of French society in the second half of the 20th century from the point of view of somebody who's not fully French and fully white are fairly damning, in the sense that you say, this is kind of the niece remarking on her experience of growing up in the suburb, that there were practically no Black people on French television, certainly no Black women. We can expand that and think more broadly, there were just no role models for one to look up to. She goes on to say that she continued to want to integrate herself into the national landscape, and even enthusiastically celebrated the values of la patrie, of France. But she definitely, I'm citing you here, she definitely felt that something was not quite right about the promises of the French Republic had made. thinking about this idea that there was something not quite right about the promises the French Republic had made. What about today? Do you think things are better? How is the French Republic fulfilling its promises or not today?
Okay, first she's fully French. Yes. That's the point. Yeah. She's fully French, and yet she doesn't really find her place in her own country. She doesn't come from another country. She's not a foreigner. But we still have that problem now. It's it's in every conversation now, and people from my generation, for example, a lot of people coming from whose parents come from the islands have studied, have been students in the university, and now they are beginning to talk, and we see what it provokes. Oh, they are woke. It's coming from the US, which is not true, because this kind of réflexion come from French intellectual before the World War II or just after, like Frantz Fanon, who is a French intellectual, and a lot of other people like this. But it is still a problem to talk about that because of this notion of universalism, which is a myth. We talked about the myth that people were building in the islands, but it's the same in France. In the French territory, we have some myth, and a strong myth is the universalism, and everybody is equal, no question of skin color, no question of where you are from. And in fact, when you see the fact, it's not true. We see that there is a lot of difficulties for people coming from the islands, just like people coming from Africa. So I wanted to tackle, you say, this situation through this story, because we are still in the same point, and it seems to me that we've been talking about that for 60, 70 years now, and it's still the same.
Although I would say that we can hope that in terms of role models, certainly there are more role models today for young people, right? And you yourself are one of them.
Yeah,
so
precisely.
how do you feel now as filling that huge void in the second half of the 20th century, because people can turn on the television and see you. You're very successful. You're on the best television shows.
Yeah. A lot of people from my generation or younger come to me and say, oh, this is really important, and that book opened my eyes, and they're really happy to see that. And I'm not the only one, huh? There are some others. But in fact, it is true that this problem has been so undertoned,
undertold, not told, not spoken about.
That for a long time, for example, for my generation, when I was younger, the only role models I had were Americans and not French, because of this lack of presence in the French media. And so we are now learning to have our own role models in France, but it's difficult.
To think, let's have another kind of political discussion, which is that, to ask the kind of hard-hitting question, which is not only that you don't speak Creole, but this is not your tradition, as you mentioned, and there have been debates in America, certainly around Amanda Gorman's collection of poetry. There was a huge outcry that her translator was not Black. How do you feel about this, that the person who's translating one's work must be the exact identity? Do you agree with this? How do you think about it?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and I'm so glad that it's coming to light, because I think for so often we've had conversations about how many works translated in the past have not even cited a translator, so you have no context about culturally where they're coming from. So this is an important question. I think for me, it's very important to stay humble around it, humble not only linguistically, but culturally. I think to do it again, I would approach the publisher who translated you and say, it's my preference to be sure that there's not someone else, maybe from the African diaspora, who has wanted to or that you could identify that might want to translate this. I think to do it again, I would do that. But translation, it will always be a bridge between a culture to another, from a language to another. So there is that implicit built-in part of just not knowing. And so for me, humility becomes so important, and like really just deferring to experts who are not myself, whether they're a Cameroonian expert on the cheap or Estelle-Sarah herself or other people I know, to inform me about it.
I'm having a kind of flashback to last week when I mentioned we had Suleiman Bachir Diegan, who was sitting right here, and he spoke about this, and he said, I think what you said is really lovely in the sense of offering it out before you yourself translate it. But he said, in what world do we live in where people can't translate each other's work? I mean, to translate something is to take a step in somebody else's direction, to offer empathy, to offer humility. And in a world in which only same identities are translating each other, that's not translation. I mean, what's so radical about translation is really getting inside the head of someone else, understanding them, and then bringing it back into your own context.
I would agree. And yet, like, I also could imagine a scenario, where an American who is from the Caribbean, for example, with Caribbean heritage, who hears the same kinds of stories that you hear around the table, who has the same gestures and the same sound effects, would be better placed than someone like me to do the translation.
What do you think?
I totally agree with Julia. I was very happy to have Julia as a translator. I think that this would be interesting if a writer coming from the English islands would try to translate my book. But in the same time, I'm very happy when Julia says that Antoine reminds her of her own ancestor, because it's a universal story. So I'm mixed. I totally agree with Julia. We have to give opportunities to people coming from the same culture. But I agree also with Suleiman that universalism also means that someone with another culture can understand what you are.
Okay, I have 2 more questions, and then we'll open it up to all of you. One phrase that really stuck with me, Estelle-Sarah, was this idea of looking back to the past, but not getting stuck in the past. And so this falls kind of in the middle. This is the niece saying, when I was speaking with Antoine 15 years later, I understood that I needed the same freedom. I needed to acknowledge the past without endlessly looking backward. Can you talk about this distinction between acknowledging the past and not endlessly spending time in the past to be free?
Mm-hmm. But yes, it's very simple, and I'm certainly not the first one to tell that. It's just that you have to know your history, of course, but you have to know it to go forward and to move on in your life and your society, because everything always is changing. We are not stuck in a moment of history, and so it's important to know where your roots are, but you have to grow.
Yeah. So this is great. This is a great garden metaphor. We have the roots, we have this idea of growing. So this will get to our last question. So I suppose kind of moving on from the attack on French universalism, the end of your book, I found, Estelle-Sarah, was actually fairly hopeful, with this image, this portrait of a kind of Parisian arrondissement. And it relates to this idea of the garden, of the Creole garden, le jardin créole, which was not translated specifically by Julia, and we'll talk about why. So actually, can we just have a discussion about what is, first of all, what for you is le jardin créole as you describe it at the end, and then we'll talk about the translation, and then we can maybe read it. Yeah.
Oh, it was, I started with a very concrete situation. I could see in Guadeloupe that people, women or men, equally, were all having their own little garden where they grow plants for medicinal purposes, but also for food purposes, and also for adornments like flowers. It's all mixed, and the fact that it's mixed prevents a plant from being eaten by insects, for example, because a plant can protect another plant. So it's important, and it's also rooted in the time of slavery, where slaves had only their little tiny part of land where they could have their own food, and so it's rooted in a very old tradition, and it's also for me a metaphor you can of resiliency and Guadeloupean society that is so mixed. So the Jardin Créole had many significances for me. And it's funny because at the beginning, it was a part in the book that we were not sure with my editor to keep. And we had a discussion, and finally we decided to keep it. And finally, it's one of the parts that we are that I'm most asked about. So yeah.
And also just to add two more significations, which is that you mentioned that it's a way of being in touch with heritage and ancestry because you're with the soil and the roots, and also that this lovely idea of kind of burying your worries and kind of putting burying your worries into the soil.
It has a therapeutical effect, the fact that you grow your own plants and you work with the soil. It's very important, and I think that it became a tool to survive for the former slaves. And it's funny because finally it is something very actual, very because we talk about more ecological practices, and the fact that you mix a lot of plants, flowers with fruits, with medicinal plants is now something that is taught in agricultural schools, and the therapeutical aspect of gardening is something that we saw, especially during the pandemic, where we were all confined. A lot of people were so happy to have their own little garden to escape.
So why not translate it?
So in the sentence where it comes up, it sounds like this: my neighborhood is still in harmony like that, full of life. I couldn't live anywhere else but in a jardin créole. And to say like a Creole garden, I don't know that for the American reader, that would suggest what you want it to suggest. I think if we were to say Creole garden, we might think, oh, is this like a little herb garden? We have nothing points to what you explained. We might think it has to do with spices because it's the Caribbean, and that's completely superficial and probably incorrect. And so, translators, I think, use a selective lens about what to keep. And I always kept the Creole. And this term I also chose to keep just to honor the idea itself.
So as we get to the end of the book, so it's the niece visiting her aunt. We'll keep it kind of vague so that I don't want to spoil the ending, but they're having a very intimate and kind of it's a very charged moment, we can say that. And she basically says to her aunt, so the aunt raises this idea of the Creole garden, and then she says, oh, my mind is kind of like that, and she sees that sits kind of uneasily with the aunt, and so then she comes back with a more, as we say, actual and kind of concrete example of where this comes up in her life. So, and this for me was one of the most moving passages. I mean, there are many moving passages in the book, which you all must read, but this for me really, of course, but I think we'll start with Estelle-Sarah because we wanted to hear you read in French. So this is the description of Le Jardin Créole in Paris. And it's a hopeful vision, I think, of French society and of a mixed society for the future, mixed in every sense of the word.
So can you show me again which? Thank you. Là où j'habite, c'est un endroit précieux, plein de gens mélangés qui ne se ressemblent pas. Des riches, des pauvres, des jeunes, des vieux. C'est ça que tu aimais près du Sacré-Cœur, pas vrai? Ce n'est plus tellement ainsi vers la basilique, mais ça revient ailleurs. Mon quartier est toujours en chorale comme ça, plein de vigueur. Je ne pourrais pas vivre autre part que dans un jardin créole. Je tiens ça de toi. On est plus libre quand on est au beau milieu du spectacle du monde.
Listen, I told her, you're right. Even now, I could have already created one around me. Where I live is very special, full of people, all of them different from one another, mixed together, rich, poor, young, old. That's what you loved about living near Sacré-Cœur, isn't it? It's not really that way up near the Basilica anymore, but you see it in other neighborhoods. My neighborhood is still in harmony like that, full of life. I couldn't live anywhere else but in a jardin créole. I get that from you. We're freer we are freer when we are in the middle of the spectacle of this world.
Thank you so much. Can we have a big round of applause, please, for
Thank
Julia and
you.
Estelle-Sarah? Thank you so much. Thank you. Are there any audience questions? We have about 15 minutes. Yes.
Okay. To the other, in French or English? In English, okay. I'm sorry I've not read your book, but now I will. What's the title?
Oh, the title, yeah. We have to talk about the title. Là où les chiens aboient par la queue, which is a weird title in French and also, I guess, in English. And it comes from an expression in Creole, la chien qui a jappé paquet. And it means a place totally lost in the middle of nowhere in Guadeloupe, where when you live in a place where there are no roads, no transportation, no electricity, no running water, well, in the middle of nowhere, which is the case of Antoine. She was born in a place like this in Guadeloupe. When you live in a place like that in Guadeloupe, you say, oh, you live la chien qui a jappé paquet, where the dogs bark with their tails, which means that it's so weird, it's so éloigné, so far that even the dogs are not the same as anywhere else. And the equivalent in French would be le trou du cul du monde. I don't know in English if there is an equivalent.
There would be, we would abbreviate it politely as BFE, really far out there.
You can say it.
I'm not going to say
Okay.
it.
Any more in-person questions? Have someone Zoom.
I was wondering when you said something about living here, and I don't know if I have it right, but somebody asked you how you felt how things had changed. And I got the impression that things had changed, but not enough. Is that?
Yeah,
accurate?
maybe you're right. Things are changing. I think that with my generation, some people dare to talk about these questions, and there are a lot of universitaire academics about this problem. So it's changing, but it's not still not a very common thought that there is some discrimination in France and some racism. It's still something that French people tend to avoid or nier, deny, especially because we have the example of the US, where in the US, it's a very more open topic. You have movies about that, you have a lot of books about this. And I think that French people tend to see these movies and to say, oh, it's horrible. Americans are so racist. Americans are so this, that, and it avoids to see what we are in France. It's like we are not like this.
We have a great question on Zoom. This is from Emily, who says, such beautiful discourse around such a beautiful book. Thank you to everyone involved. Question, and this is to both of you, what is one of the biggest risks you took with writing and then translating the book? And if speak into the light.
So this is for me first. Yeah, the biggest risk in writing, no risk. It was a total pleasure to write. The only thing is I was asking myself, since I was not really born in the French islands, I was always asking myself, what will they think of this book? And maybe in Guadeloupe, maybe they will be angry. Maybe they will tell me, you're not allowed to talk about this because you're not from here. You were not born here. So it was like, I was a little bit scared of their reactions. And when the book was released, I had a lot of very positive reviews in France, in the French main territory. I don't know how, in the hexagon. Yeah. And I was very happy about it, but still I was always asking myself and them, what will they say about the book? And I had a little clue, when I received a very, very famous prize in the islands called Le Prix du Tout Monde, Édouard Glissant. And when I received this prize, I thought to myself, oh, maybe they will accept it because it's a very important prize. And if I have this prize, that at least some of them are happy with that book. And when I went for the promotion of the book there, I was so warmly welcome that it was a relief for me. And that was the biggest risk, I think, talking about a story which is part of me, but not that much.
I think my risks were more maybe cultural and technical. Like, am I up to the challenge of trying to penetrate what it is that is being told in Estelle-Sarah's story and all the different layers culturally? But down to the micro level of the technical production of a translation, I have a fun example for you all. It felt risky to jump in and be like, okay, are you ready to handle all of these cultural illusions that you necessarily, as good as my French is, I won't get? And there's a passage about that makes reference to Captain Haddock from Tintin. And the niece is writing about her father's accent, people with the same skin color and the same lilting accent that was just like Captain Haddock's bandage. That's what you would have gotten had I not done my job. And so what that required was me to like learn and look into this. So this is a stealth gloss. This is where I get to embed little things. So the risk I take all the time is trying to balance stealth glossing with trusting the reader with what they may know or be able to look up on their own. His accent that was as ever present as the bandage that Tintin's Captain Haddock never managed to shake off. And it's an expression in French. It's to describe something, a situation that you just can't, it won't resolve itself, right? Exactly. And so like that comparison to an accent, I didn't want to get that wrong.
Yeah, you didn't know Captain Haddock?
I didn't know, I continue to learn more.
I also would like to acknowledge the truly international makeup of our audience, with people from California, Ohio, suburbs of Paris, Durban, South Africa, Atlanta, Georgia, and a suburb of Washington, DC. So very cool to have a Zoom audience from all over the world. And we have another in-person question.
Sarah, I bought your French book 2 years ago, but I don't read it. So when you speak about parts of people who live in French island, you forgot China people?
Yeah, of course, Chinese people. There are a lot. Okay, yes, people from Congo and a lot. Yeah.
And at first, in the French island, my mother said to me that Jardin Creole, we have the slave had 2 Jardin Creole, 2 area for Jardin Créole. In front of the house, it was the flower Jardin Créole, Jardin de Bienvenue, and behind near the kitchen cuisine, the aromatic and medicinal garden and Jardin Créole, and after they have only one.
Yeah, exactly. I agree.
More questions? Okay, this is a lovely question from Samantha. I'd love to hear more about the character that reminds Julie of her great aunt and why. She's such a formidable character. Tell us both about this character.
Sure, let's start. Would you start, Estelle-Sarah, by just describing Antoine? I'd like to hear you describe her, and then I'll tell you how it's connected to my family.
Okay. Antoine is very daring. We can say that. She's very beautiful, but she doesn't care at all. She only wears very practical clothes. Men's shoes because it's more comfortable for her, and she doesn't want anyone to tell her what she has to do. She doesn't want to marry, she doesn't want to have children. She wants to live her own life with her own terms, and doesn't want to be embarrassée, burdened with men.
Yeah, and I think the connection that I drew, they're about the same generation. So this is my great aunt on the Kentucky side of my family, great aunt Lily. And she was a wonderful inspiration to me in terms of her boldness as a woman. But similarly, she did what she wanted. Instead of never being married, my great aunt Lily was married 4 times. And
that's
so
the same in the end.
There we go. It's the same. She was a dancer and had this, she carried herself with the same poise. I think Antoine carried herself. And ultimately, she really, as some might say down in Kentucky, where my family is from, she didn't give a hang what people said. She didn't care at all what people would say about her. And there's a lot of humor there too. And she's difficult. You struggle with Lily, you struggle with Antoine, but she's fascinating.
Yeah, they could be sisters.
So this is a great point because obviously the French version of this book was published several years ago. So you've been promoting it now for several years and it's just been translated. And I asked this question actually a lot in interviews when it's been a while since the book has been published. What for you has been striking about what people have been asking about the book? And is there anything that for you in the book is really central that you feel people have missed? That while you were writing it, you thought, this is clearly a really great point that I'm making and that people just haven't picked up on for whatever reason.
What strikes me is the fact that in the beginning, I really thought naively that the book would interest only people having more or less the same story, people coming from the French islands, maybe people coming from Algeria, because we have a very large Algerian community in France, but not more. And I was really impressed to see that finally my book was, the story was talking to anyone, and even someone who left Britain, La Bretagne, Britain? Yeah, which is a part of France, to come to Paris, could have the same feelings as Antoine. And it was really moving for me to see how Antoine just stole the heart of so many readers who had nothing to do with the French islands. So it was really moving for me. And what they missed, I think they didn't miss that. That was impressive because they really understand what I wanted to tell. Maybe some people didn't really get what I wanted to say about the Guadeloupean society, but this came from people from France who had lived there for many years, and who were a little bit in denial concerning racism and how stratified the society is in Guadeloupe. And so they told me, but it's not true what you're saying, it's not like this, but it was just denial. So I had very few reactions like that.
And we had a question in the chat. I don't know if there's enough time has passed to answer it, but how has the translation been received in the States?
Well, it only comes out July 5th.
So, okay, so it's
Yeah. Yeah. So we've been preparing for quite a while now. There were some delays with COVID, et cetera.
We have one big final round of applause, please.